suffocate?
Yeah, who wants to suffocate? Personally, I don't want to. And so you recognize it's a protection reflex that's been given. And the head is protected by arm extension and arm flexion. I find that interesting. Later on, you hold a baby who has some neck control, and you take them, you hold them underneath the arms, and you go, whoop, lean them forward. You don't have to make that noise if you don't want, but you can. And you lean them forward like this, very suddenly, and you'll see that parachute reflex. They go into that as if you've thrown them out of an airplane. Again, something I wouldn't do, throw them out of an airplane. So you recognize parachute reflex. All sorts of these things are, your book is filled with reflexes. And if you read them, you go, what? What is that? They throw some little stick drawings of it in. They're okay. But recognizing how you got to play with children and see some of these things. At very young ages, you'll see those things elicited. So a reflexive level of development is where we begin our movement. And it happens way before we're born. It happens inside the womb. And it continues beyond, but they begin to dissipate or disappear, or something happens to those reflexes. Where do they go? Because you can't function later on in life with those reflexes. We don't know. We really don't know. We have some suspicions. And can I give you my own prejudice on where I think the reflexes go? I think they're still there. I think they're subcortical in nature, but they get overridden by higher brain centers as we grow older. Because you see the RAF is mature, that's not the Royal Air Force, by the way, the reticular activating formation, is mature or very close to a 90% mature at birth, where the cerebral cortex has a lot of maturation to take place yet. And so once the fast-conducting nerve fibers are growing and maturing and laying down the fatty lipid sheath on the nerve fibers to allow for fast-conducting nerve fibers, then the cerebral cortex begins to take over. I believe that's the case. What is my evidence for it? It's not just faith that I'm taking that on. It's when somebody has a closed head injury. You've seen somebody, perhaps for those of you who will become therapists, you'll find that within your clinics that you'll treat, and you'll find specialists within your clinics that deal with closed head injuries, traumatic brain injury. We'll oftentimes see them back functioning at this level of the motor development model. You seriously will see this. And so with that understanding, you've got to have some pretty good knowledge of reflexes. As an adapted physical educator, I had to have knowledge of reflexes. I goofed up once in my teaching, only once, but I goofed up once in my teaching. When I was teaching in Flint Public Schools, I had a student in my class who had cerebral palsy. And I was working on certain activities, and eventually the occupational therapist came to me and said, what are you doing? Because we're getting some setbacks in what we're doing since you started working with this young lady. And I said, oh, I've been working on some flexibility, some range of motion stuff. They said, well, so are we. I was reinforcing the the asymmetric tonic neck reflex. They were trying to dissipate it, and the activities that I was doing was reinforcing the reflex. And so they were seeing a setback. So you have to have knowledge to work at all levels of the model. And you're going, what's the asymmetric tonic neck reflex? It's this one. It's the fencer's position. If I were to clap my hands loudly, it worked. You have some vestiges left over of the startle reflex, don't you? Do you ever blink with loud noises? Especially at younger ages, you can probably remember somebody hammering. Maybe your father or your mother were hammering something, and every time your eyes would blink. That's a vestige of the Moro reflex. Moro reflex meaning that you startle in extension and then you pull back into flexion. A young man that I used to work with, spent a lot of time with that had cerebral palsy, and it wasn't Chris Klein who spoke in chapel today, but another young man. He loved his coffee in the morning, and he had control of his upper limbs. He did not have aphetoid cerebral palsy that Chris has, had a different style. But I do remember he had a very tight reflex that didn't dissipate. See, a lot of individuals with cerebral palsy have reflexive functioning still. Damage to the cerebellum, damage to the cerebral cortex, causes we suspect causes the lower brain centers to override or to function and continue to develop or continue to function at a reflexive level of development. So if that's the case, why does Chris sit up on the stage today? How many of you went to chapel? If you saw Chris and he moves constantly, right? That's reflexive action. You stimulate his palm, there's a grasping of it. Still, it still exists for him. And so you recognize you've got to have knowledge of all of these levels. I think I was going somewhere with that thought, and I've already lost my train. So if somebody helps me pull it back in, I'll finish that thought at some point. Maybe I'll watch my video and figure out what I was talking about. Yeah.
With Chris's case, so if he would still have those reflexes, like grasping reflex,
Yeah.
since he has control of his feet, is the Babinski not there?
Yeah, interesting, correct. He has control, and especially of one foot. And he has absolute clear control. With cerebral palsy causes this athetoid causes this constant contraction of muscles. So he could have better walking behavior than he has if he would have had extension surgery on his Achilles, and it would have helped his gait, because he can walk a few steps. And so he has never had that particular surgery done like a lot of individuals with athetoid cerebral palsy do, because he can't afford to lose function of his left foot, because then he loses his communication. Isn't that a fascinating thing? Lots of tough decisions. His reflexes are so tight in constant motion that he rubs the skin and flesh down to the bone on his thumb and forefingers. So he has these gloves that he wears that protects, neoprene and cotton combination, and his infection got so bad this last summer that they had to amputate one of his thumbs. And you think, oh my goodness, that's awful. And he's like, oh, thank goodness they amputated my thumb. Now I can't rub, and I lower the pain. And he says, I wish they'd amputate my other thumb. You haven't said that lately, have you? I wish they'd amputate my other thumb. This is something that he appreciated because it takes away that rubbing sensation for him. I know where I was going. The other young man, I started talking about Chris Klein, the other young man, I remember one day walking up behind him and saying, David, how are you? And just that startle, the moral reflex still functioning so tightly, he went into full extension with a cup of coffee in his hand, and then back into flexion, and almost could jump out of his wheelchair by the extension that he did. And I learned to not come up behind David and greet him, especially when he had a cup of coffee in his hand. Guess who cleaned up the cup of coffee? That would be me. I can still remember where I was at the time in his kitchen. Reflexes, they're there for a purpose. But we don't remain at our reflexive level of development. We have to move up the scale. Your author identifies the next stage of development as the rudimentary skill in his model of motor development, the hourglass model. I want to give you a definition of what rudimentary skills are. These are the basic movement skills that are voluntary in nature now. It includes stability skills and some locomotion. We go through a series of skill development to get to the point where our rudimentary skills happen. This is a voluntary movement. Lifting the neck, propping up to this point, and these are in order of how they work, to mommy holding you on her lap, and daddy holding you on your lap and picking you up and having you strengthen your legs through various activities, and children can bounce at a very young age, to sitting alone with this really huge object at the top of your body called your head, because your head is much, much more mature and therefore is reached closer to full size at birth. Matter of fact, a quarter of your body size at birth is your head. At this point, I always like to say, take a look at your neighbor. Picture them with a quarter of their body size as their head. You thinking Steven Spielberg a little bit? Something out of Star Wars? My head would be about that big, which you've been accused of having a big head before. You would have this huge head sitting up here if a quarter of your body size was your head. So babies sit and start to move, and they get their head outside the center of gravity. Boom, down they go as they begin to negotiate stability-oriented skills. And then eventually baby will creep, pulling both legs, and crawl, pulling both legs, creep with a contralateral pattern. We would expect to see this type of behavior, moving toward this, pulling themselves to a stand with a very wide base of support, to pulling that wide base